Hi guys! I haven't done an introductory video for a while in my introductory series. I kind of made the first 4 videos. I felt like I'd covered most bases or the most important aspects of my spiritual practice in those videos. But when I was looking at them again and trying to decide where I might pick up where I left off on that, I realised that I actually haven't made an entire video devoted solely to paganism. I talked about naturalistic paganism, which is a very particular kind of brand of paganism. I talked about naturalism, I talked about pantheism, and I talked about the Wheel of the Year. But I actually have never really talked in any videos, never mind just the introductory series, about my understanding of what paganism actually is and why I consider myself to be a pagan. I made a video very early on, I think it might have been even my second video, which was called Why Paganism. And well, to be honest with you, I haven't actually watched it in a long time, so I don't completely remember what I talked about in that. But that was more to do with just why I had come to the kind of spiritual practice that I had come to. I didn't really go into a definition of paganism as I see it, or anything like that at all. One of the reasons I haven't done this is because paganism is actually, it's one of those terms or labels that it's highly disputed. There was a trend in the YouTube community, it must be about a year ago now, where people were discussing this question. They were talking about what paganism is, what they understand it to mean. But I can't remember whether or not I was making videos at that time, but even if I was, it's always been a subject that I have felt very loath to go into because it stirs up a lot of heat. And it is just such a vague kind of term that I feel like even if I'm defining it, I'm not necessarily going to be defining it as a kind of, in a way that will make everyone happy. There's no way to make everyone happy when it comes to talking about what paganism actually is, because this is one of the problems, and this is particularly evident in the blogging community. There have been really fierce arguments between, say, mostly it's between polytheists, hard polytheists or devotional polytheists, and say more naturalistic pagans, or where we just have this problem where polytheists or hard polytheists or devotional polytheists, whatever you want to call them, feel that that is what paganism is to them, and if you're not a polytheist, or if you're not a hard polytheist, that you're not really a pagan, and they sort of feel that they're just unhappy about the term paganism being applied to what they see as something completely different and completely unrelated to anything that they do. And there are a lot of polytheists now who are starting to just call themselves polytheists rather than pagans because they want to dissociate themselves from the greater community. And I'm sure I've mentioned that before in other videos. I think in my video on labels and pantheism and that kind of stuff, that when that issue came up, I was talking about that a bit. I see absolutely no problem with using a label for myself that I know that other people use in a very different way. I have no problem with being part of a community which has people with very diverse belief systems within it. So first of all, I will say that if you're looking for a definition of paganism or paganisms, a great place to start is John Halstead's blog post on the 3 centres of paganism. Now different bloggers have kind of pulled this apart, and some have added in extra centres to paganism, but I think his post is a very good place to start because he developed this theory coming from a place where he realised that there were pagans who had completely different views to him, and he was sort of trying to see how there could be such diverse belief systems and diverse practices within this one umbrella term. So John Halstead's 3 centres of paganism are deity-centred, self-centred, self with a capital S, and nature-centred or earth-centred. And this works very well for me. To his mind, some people will fall into all 3 categories, but some people will focus on only one, sort of almost to the exclusion of the others. So you will have pagans who focus on deity, who aren't necessarily that big into the Wheel of the Year and nature, kind of nature-based practices. They mightn't consider themselves to be to have an earth-based spirituality, and then you might have sort of self-centered pagans who are very much more about sort of self-development, inner work and magic and stuff like that, usually sort of a psychological model, who don't necessarily work with deities in a major sense, and who again maybe they're not involved in, like I say, sort of an earth-centered type spirituality. But for me, I feel that, now this is my own personal definition of paganism, I think there are a lot of people who will only choose to go one of those ways, and that's all perfectly valid and fine. And I definitely think that paganism as a term can include a whole lot of different types of beliefs and systems, and I do think that those three centres that can overlap or not is a really good way of explaining why paganism is so different to different people. But from here on in, I'm going to talk about what paganism is to me, and I'm not saying that I think that my definition is better or more correct or accurate than anybody else's. What I mean when I'm talking like this is really that if I didn't have any of these components in my practice, I would probably not consider myself to be a pagan. I just would choose not to use that term, because there are other terms that fit me very well, like pantheism. Earth-based spirituality is a good one, but I personally prefer nature-based spirituality because I do focus on the earth and the earth cycles and things like that, because, you know, I'm living on earth and this is my primary experience of cosmos. But I also do incorporate things that go way beyond earth as well. So I like nature-based spirituality because that actually for me encompasses the whole of the universe. So I could just go along with those terms and not use paganism at all. And I think about that quite often every now and then, because I kind of think to myself, okay, well, why am I calling myself a pagan? Is that actually really accurate? I've got to the point now where when I'm telling new people about my spiritual practice who aren't aware of it, who have never really, maybe even really heard that much about the pagan movement or anything, more often than not I will broach the subject by saying that I practice a nature-based spirituality. And if I go a little bit further, I will mention pantheism, and then if we go a little bit more in depth, I will talk about paganism. But at the outset, I tend to say that it is a nature-based spirituality because I feel like it's more explanatory of what I do. It's more kind of, it's just a bit clearer for people who aren't just completely not in the know at all. It's sort of, it is what it says on the tin. Whereas if you say to somebody, I'm a pagan, that can mean so many different things to so many different people. They might not have any clue what you mean by that at all, or they might think you know and they don't really know. Whereas I feel like nature-based spirituality is a pretty good and accurate way of describing what I'm all about. But anyway, I do actually use the term pagan. I do consider myself to be a pagan and part of the pagan community, so I'm going to talk about that now a little bit more. So I actually, when I started thinking about why I consider myself a pagan, and what paganism is to me, I definitely started from that core of the three centres of paganism. And then there's another blogger, John Beckett. He has a blog called Under the Ancient Oaks. I believe it was him who added a fourth sort of centre to that original idea, which was community. And I actually realised that those four centres, while community is definitely not part of my spiritual practice, I have never actually met a group of pagans or any sort of official pagan event or anything like that. I actually haven't been to anything like that yet in Dublin. I keep meaning to, but it's just not something, possibly mainly because I don't think I'm actually going to have a huge amount in common with the other Dublin pagans. There aren't that many of them, and I feel that I don't necessarily fit in very well with your average pagan. And this isn't to say that I don't want to at some point get around to doing that, but it's just not something that I have so far actually engaged with. So community isn't a part of my spiritual practice at all, but obviously I am very much a part of the pagan community online, and I really, really enjoy having that community online. And that is probably why I haven't gone looking for a physical community, because I don't have as much of a need for it, because I do have people online who I really enjoy talking to, engaging with, and learning about their practices. So I realised that those four centres are actually the main reasons I consider myself a pagan, and for me are the main components of paganism. For me, I would not consider myself to be a pagan if I didn't in some way acknowledge deities or invite deities into my rituals, or in some way work with deities of some form. Now this is pretty broad for me. I don't work with like one particular pantheon. I don't even work with deities that often, that frequently. I don't really even have a very kind of set devotional practice set up, although I would very much like to develop my devotional practices for various deities. It's just something that I haven't really had the space and time to really get down with so far. But for me, I feel that when it comes to spiritual practice and ritual, which I'm going to talk about again in a second, one of the things that makes me feel that I am actually a pagan is that I utilize kind of names and images and symbolism that is inspired by pantheons, kind of ancient pagan pantheons, or even that I'm using the names and the figures of actual specific deities to work with in my practice. So what I mean by that is that obviously I work with Morrigan, occasionally I work with Ganesha, and I have done some sort of path working and encountered a couple of other deities as well. So I do actually work with pagan deities, and that makes my practice feel pagan. But even if I wasn't before working with those specific deities, and for a long time I actually wasn't, I'd say for the first year of serious practice, I was using Gaia's name, but I wasn't actually interacting with her as a deity. What I feel is that the way I interact with the divine, the way I revere the divine in my spiritual practice, is through giving it sort of symbols and faces that are similar to pagan deities. I know a lot of pantheists like to stick with the idea of the divine as just having a oneness to it. So it's almost like monotheism, but obviously not quite. They definitely overlap a lot, pantheism and monotheism. In fact, there are a lot of pantheist Christians. So a lot of the time they like to work with sort of a faceless all, and it's more like just honouring the sort of creative power or life force or energy of the universe. And they don't really go any further than that in terms of symbolism and attaching names or anthropomorphic figures or anything like that to that idea. Whereas I have always enjoyed breaking down my understanding of the divine into component parts and into names. Obviously I used Gaia a lot in the beginning, but from very early on I was really interested in the idea of, well, first of all I was using the idea of the triple goddess. It is very important for me to sort of acknowledge the oneness and the connectivity of everything, but I find it very important as well for me to break down different aspects of existence and how things work. Obviously most of that isn't really like related to, you know, pagan gods or deities, but I feel like what I'm doing with that is very similar to a sort of ancient pagan system of having different faces and having different symbols for components of the divine. I feel that the deity-centric aspect leads quite nicely into the self-centric aspect, which is essentially inner work and ritual and that kind of thing. Pagan ritual in the sort of neo-pagan movement, it developed very much from a ceremonial magic background. But it's interesting when you sort of read about it and when you read the books, say moving from the very early texts into the later texts of sort of the 60s and 70s and 80s, there starts to a very sort of Jungian influence starts to come into the writings and into the rituals and into the thoughts on magic and on ritual and on what's actually going on with pagan ritual. The whole idea of individuation, I feel like that's all very central to the kind of themes and the sort of the whole feel behind the development of ritual in the pagan movement. For me, I think pagan ritual is it's about a couple of different things. It's about obviously tapping into the all, it's about tapping into archetypes and deities and stuff like that, and honouring the cycles of Earth that we are experiencing and things like that. But I think maybe primarily it's about doing self-work, and about connecting the unconscious with the conscious mind. And this is all my own personal opinion and my own personal experience, of course. Because for me, all of that connection and everything is all actually already there in the unconscious. The unconscious is a very much aware of the seasons, and a very much in tune with the idea that we are, that everything is connected and all of that kind of thing. And ritual is just sort of a means of tapping into that inner world and making connection in that way. I also think that the sort of aspect of looking at the self and opening up into that kind of more sort of subjective reality, and also of course the whole sort of celebration of the sensual that is present in paganism, and the immanence of the divine. And of course then we have the whole thing of the divine not being simply only masculine, but also being feminine, or in some cases only being feminine, or at least being addressed through female symbolism. All of that ties in very nicely with feminism as well, and with a sort of restoring of the universe and of cosmos in a way that is more meaningful for women, and well, more meaningful in general, because it's balancing out a lot of the imbalance that has come about in society, where we focus on the sort of masculine, the very sort of logical and empirical kind of ways of seeing the world, and I feel that there's a lot about paganism and pagan ritual that sort of rectifies that cognitive dissonance between the way that our unconscious mind, our symbolic mind experiences the world, and the way that our outer reality tells us that we should understand things and the way we should experience things. So that's a very important aspect for me too. Revering nature, of course, is absolutely central to my practice, and it is one of the reasons that I consider myself to be pagan too. I do definitely consider nature, reverence, earth worship, that kind of thing, to be really central to paganism. It's kind of always been there, and I would say that it's a bit of a cliche to say that ancient paganisms were more attuned with the earth and the earth cycles, and that they were very much nature based and nature worshipping, but I think it's definitely true, and that has always been a part of the growing pagan movement as well, obviously with the wheel of the year and following the moon cycles and everything from the outset. Nature worship and nature reverence and following the cycles of the year has very definitely been a part of the development of the pagan movement. Now obviously there are people who don't feel that that's a huge component of their path, but for me it is, and it is one of the reasons that I consider myself to be a pagan. Or at least I feel that aspect of my spirituality slots in nicely with other pagans' experiences, and slots in nicely with the story of paganism and the growing of the pagan movement. It fits me into that history, it fits me into that sort of spectrum. And then lastly we have that question of kind of community. I feel that lineage and community is actually a large part of the reason that I call myself a pagan. I can very easily define my practices and my beliefs without using the word pagan at all. But yeah, one of the reasons I like to use the term pagan is because I like to be a part of that community. I feel like as spiritual communities go, I have probably a lot more in common with the pagan community as a whole than any other spiritual community. There are a lot of different types of pagans. There's a whole community of naturalistic pagans with whom I obviously have an awful lot in common. A lot of pagans are pantheists. I feel that does kind of stem from the more Jungian kind of feel that came into paganism somewhere along the line, and Wicca obviously. And also there's just the fact that when I started exploring all of this, the people that I originally came across call themselves pagans. I came to it as paganism. So pagan is a word that I've been kind of carrying with me for a long time. I never resonated hugely with the word witch, but I've very definitely resonated with pagan as a label for myself. And I think just even purely for that reason, it's sort of evocative for me of the very outset of my journey down my own spiritual path, and a movement away from, I mean, I'd already moved away from Christianity, but a movement away from what I thought was just sort of atheism, that there was nothing else there for me. So yeah, as a word, it's just hugely evocative and emotional for me. It has a lot of meaning to it for me. And of course, going back to the ritual aspect of paganism, the way that I do ritual has very much been inspired by Wiccan ritual and by just general pagan ritual, because general pagan ritual tends to be quite similar to Wiccan ritual. It seems to have all kind of come out of that same those same influences, which, as I said before, is kind of primarily influenced by ceremonial magic. And yeah, I mean, my ritual might not particularly look like Wiccan ritual anymore, but that's how I learned to do ritual. I learned to do ritual by learning to cast a circle, and I very much, even when I take bits out and put things in and change things around, I feel like the general structure of what I do in ritual and how I have learned to worship and to observe has very much been learned from the general pagan movement, and that's, yeah, I think pagan ritual and pagan deities, I think when it boils down to it, would be the two primary reasons that I would consider myself to be a pagan. So I hope this was useful and informative for you all. If you have any questions or comments, of course, feel free to leave a comment below. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe. And also, if you haven't subscribed to my newsletter, I send out weekly updates, and I also send out an exclusive article on connecting to your heart story on the dark moon. So if you're interested in signing up to my free newsletter, you can click the link in the description box below. Thanks for watching, guys. Talk to you again soon.